Brent, how about if you set the tone and leap right in?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks. My background is really the living through the dot-com boom and bust in the San Francisco area, being in a number of different startups, some of which were successful, some of them uh, massive failures. Um, as John mentioned, sort of after the bust, there are people, particular Steve Blank, writing, but others too. Design thinking was actually just kind of starting at the same time, but writing about how do successful startups successfully create products that people want, and why are we making startups look like big businesses when big businesses notoriously fail at creating products that people want? And so I ended up writing the first book that talked about lean startup and customer development and product market fit and all of that great, and sort of launched this different career. I ended up writing a book called The Lean Entrepreneur. I was lucky enough that hit the New York Times list, and I built a company that was trying to teach some of this, what I call entrepreneurial spirit, to very large organizations. And so over the last 10 years, I've learned a lot of lessons on what you can do inside those large organizations and what you can't do, and what the needs are. So sort of eating my own dog food, I set out to write a book a couple of years ago that really basically was saying that so large businesses believe in this innovation industry perpetuated myth that 90 or 95 or 99% of your business should be focused on execution mode. And then there's this small little innovation group over here, and they do exploration mode, and everybody's good to go. And of course, it doesn't work. It's not true. I think especially since really the Great Recession, the amount of uncertainty inside of the organization has grown like tremendously, and it's across the organization. It's in the very core business. And a matter of fact, what I really found inside these large businesses is they don't really want to fund innovation. They want to fund innovation theater. They want to use the innovation as a buzzword, but they're actually not going to put money into sort of reinventing their business. And the more I thought about it, the more reasonable that actually seemed to me. I have this whole other topic that I want to rant on, which is the end of the disruptive innovation, Clayton Christensen model of disruptive innovation. I think we're sort of done with it, but I won't go into that here. What I want people to think about is just the amount of uncertainty that's in the world today, and I really believe in the premise of this next book, Disruption Proof, is that it's really the change from the industrial age into the digital age. It's akin to the change from the agricultural stage into the industrial stage. It fundamentally is realigning all of society. And yet the way we tend to manage businesses and institutions, including government and education and nonprofits and unions, the way they're structured and managed is still based upon the assembly line of the industrial age. And I fundamentally think all of that is going to change. The interconnectedness of the world, the speed of information, the speed of disinformation. We're all carrying around computers in our pockets that are 10,000s of times more powerful than the first computers that were in rooms, the size of rooms. And it just means that information, knowledge, change lives on the edge. It lives on the edge of the economy. It lives on the edge of our business. Information flows from the edge into the company. And so centralized, hierarchical, command and control, decision-making, top down, that's where the information is the smallest. It's the least amount of information. And so that the trend is really towards decentralizing decision-making. And of course, that's really hard. We don't have the trust in between, from the center out to the edge, there's not the trust. And boy, 2 years ago, having these thoughts in November of 2019, I was speaking at an innovation conference. And of course, I'm sort of like this anti-innovation keynote speaker at an innovation conference. And I was using Game of Thrones slides where I said, winter is coming. Your budgets are going to be crushed. You're going to have to find new roles inside of your business. Winter is coming. And of course, I had no idea the winter that was actually coming. I was thinking, a little economic downturn, but crazily enough, COVID hits. Nobody's thinking about innovation anymore, quote unquote innovation. The very core business of businesses all over the world is completely rocked, right? So if you're in execution mode and suddenly all of the uncertainty of the pandemic hits you, you can't just buckle down. You can't do what you were doing yesterday. You actually have to reinvent. You have to reimagine. You have to apply that entrepreneurial spirit to your core business. And a lot of businesses were caught unaware. And so I didn't set out to write a pandemic book, but it ends up the pandemic sort of driving home this idea that everybody needs a little bit of this entrepreneurial spirit. And so, yeah, so that's what disruption proof is about. It's about we are being disrupted, whether we like it or not. And it's not just tech startups. It's, the collapsing energy grid in Texas. It's ransomware attacks on healthcare systems. I was a patient in a healthcare system in San Diego that, was attacked by ransomware, and their IT systems completely shut down, which included care, not just, I can't make an appointment, but the equipment is attached to IT and it was down. And so, of course, the ships getting stuck in canals and really the supply chain issues that we're facing now. And of course, the pandemic. In my view, these disruptions are ongoing. It's sort of the way of the world. And so what we have to do is think about the way we're structuring and managing our businesses so that they're more resilient, that they're aware of all of these changing conditions and can dynamically change their plans based upon that new information. So that's what disruption proof is about. And yeah, I guess I'll pause there. That was quite, sort of teeing up a large potential conversation there, John.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always thought that large companies have a bunch of middle manager antibodies that go around and suck up budgets of other places that are not productive, and innovation is not productive, and therefore let's kill them and take their budget. So their half-life is like 18 months to 3 years, and then somebody steals their budget and then they have to restart. So it looks like innovation theater, but what it really is the side effect of the antibodies actually, gathering resources from where they can. And innovation never has sufficient power in the ecosystem to sustain those antibodies. So there was a guy in New York, Trevor Owens, that wrote a book and talked about innovation colonies, right? Where you take the innovation part, you put it outside, away from the antibodies, with perhaps agreements and perhaps with some funding, but it's physically separated. And you're saying that's not sufficient, that's not interesting, because what you think you have, you don't have, and you better be adaptive now. Ride the surfboard you're on. Don't try to build something else. Am I hearing you right?
Well, so I mean, I love Trevor. Trevor, I was a mentor of Trevor's, and I think that he's actually sort of retelling the disruptive innovation cliche. And I think that I think that there are examples of companies that have spun out, companies that have gone on and done okay. There's a case study in my book, actually, of a company that did that. I think that those don't go become unicorns, so they don't replace the revenue of their existing core business. So, great for them. I'm glad they're successful, but it's not actually how you're going to survive as a large enterprises. The stories that are told that back up that particular frame are often made up by the innovation industry, and they're not true. Blockbuster is a farce of a story. It's actually hilarious how bad that story is. And Kodak is another one, and Xerox is another one. I mean, they're just sort of on and on. I think that there was a period of time where companies that relied on technical invention there was some benefit to that sort of story, that you had to actually get that outside. But most companies, the vast majority of the companies, do not rely on invention anymore. And you can look at sort of the unicorns of the last 10 or 15 years, very rarely, except for in life sciences. Life sciences, obviously, you're continuing to invent medicines, and you'll find things like blockchain or AI or some technical stuff that actually does emerge. But the vast majority of companies are relying on existing technology to do something different. And it's really not that far from what the core business does. And so yeah, the whole spinning it out, that's great. But if your company is struggling today, you're just not, why should you invest in something that might bear some amount of fruit 5 or 6 or 7 years down the road? They're struggling today. So it just doesn't make logical sense to me to invest in that. I think that the antibodies exist, but what I try to tell leaders is that if you use sort of this learning mode, this exploration mode, you actually make your execution more efficient. And so that's actually how you drive change, is by showing how new techniques will improve people's ability to accomplish what they need to accomplish in the near term. And I think that if people are able to successfully use this exploration mode, this entrepreneurial spirit to improve the core business between now and 2 or 3 years down the road, then sure, they're going to start investing in longer term stuff. But I tell you what, the longer term stuff comes from acquisitions and from venturing. It doesn't come from, I'm going to go and reinvent the next big thing, in my opinion.
So we have the example of GE that got all of the attention to Eric Ries, who then spent a whole bunch of time, multiple years, training them on doing build, measure, learn loops and being innovative and assigning staff and having top-down commitment and all of the right things. And they were a shining star for a moment, and then the bottom dropped out, right? And they made a mistake, right? So how is it that structure, which I think I just heard you say, right, make every department innovative by doing your customer experiments and your market experiments everywhere and in a distributed way, that surely didn't work for GE.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that the stories that you get out of companies like that, I mean, how much do we really know what went on there? So I did a bunch of work at GE. GE actually hired a bunch of different people. Eric was in there sort of at the very top level, but Eric wasn't actually teaching them how to do experimentation, believe me. They brought in a lot of other people. Bionic, actually, David Kidder's Bionic in New York was very involved there. But so when I sort of went to work for GE, there was this huge battle about who actually was going to control that their FastWorks program. And it was innovation on one side, who actually was trying to drive impact. So how are we actually going to improve businesses, wherever we can? And HR, it was all about a cultural. So we're going to change the culture. It became a cultural, and HR actually won that battle. So HR was in charge of rolling out FastWorks across the company. And so the way they did it was, I mean, maybe, was it optimal? I don't know. I think that they actually had some successes there. So, like anything else, you have to experiment and try to figure out what works. I don't think that they drove impact. The culture side won, yet they didn't drive impact. And so when Jeff Immelt left, the CFO took over. Now the CFO is going to go right back to what's our core business and what's our financial efficiency and what's our return on investment. And so, nobody promised that it was going to happen within 5 years. But I also think that what I'm saying is the only way you're going to get the longer term buy-in is to be able to demonstrate the nearer term successes. And so we've done things that are as mundane sounding as getting a design team to work differently with the manufacturing group because you've invested in new technology. So a fashion company invests all of this money into digital fabrication equipment, and yet the processes between the people, the human beings in design and the human beings on the manufacturing floor, nobody changed that. Nobody, the company that sold them the technology didn't do it, and there was no internal processes for figuring out how do you reinvent the processes. Well, that's a core. This is not even lean startup. This is lean management. This is lean manufacturing. This is how do we actually go in there and do continuous improvement to try to figure out how to become more efficient. And so a lot of those principles have been around for ages. I think one of the primary problems is, and I write about this a little bit, is that we're using 20th century metrics. Financial efficiency is like the primary way we measure the efficiency of any business. It's how we measure even the economy from a antitrust perspective. It's all about, bigger companies are more efficient, so we got to allow all this corporate consolidation. And it's exactly opposite of what we need to be doing now in this crazy new world. If you were trying to produce a microwave oven in the 1960s, you were one of a handful of companies that could do it. The consumer didn't care what color they came in. They didn't demand particular options. It's like, if I can afford a microwave oven that improves my life, the risk was all technical and operational. It wasn't market. Today, it's completely the opposite. It's like we've got 1,000 models that, any color that you want, all of these crazy options. You can now use your iPhone, I'm sure, right, to do something with your microwave oven. I mean, it's just features upon features because we're trying to grasp how we're going to create value for customers, and the customers don't care hardly. It's, the competition for their mindset is what's crazy and difficult. And so it isn't it's a market problem. It's like, should we be building this? What could we be doing? But we've sort of, all of the supply chain issues. It's easy to build a redundant supply chain if you decide that that's what you want to do. But due to financial efficiency, the redundant supply chain is actually all overhead.
Brent, can I ask a question?
Please.
What do you think about the notion that think about the product life cycle curve?
Yep.
Think about the mentality of an early adopter and then a mainstream buyer, and then on the backside of the slope, extracting lean manufacturing processes so you squeeze the last little bit of profit out of the product.
Yep.
That same mentality, apply that to corporations and the kind of people that populate those corporations. So I'm going to throw out the premise, and I'd like your thoughts on this, that early adopters and innovators work for startups, and mainstream people, risk-averse people, work for big enterprise. And you're never going, just like you can't force a mainstream buyer to behave like an early adopter, you can't make those same people who are employees of Big Corp become innovators. You can tell them the words, you can put them on teams, you can push edge decision making, and they are still going to behave like mainstream buyers and be risk averse and want to protect their fiefdom. So you're not going to really change that very much.
Yeah. So I think that there's, number one, Peter Drucker wrote way back in the 80s on innovation and entrepreneurship. And he made a very interesting point that I agree with. Entrepreneurs are actually, they actually are better at avoiding risk, because what they do is they actively mitigate the risk. Whereas the large people are not risk avoiders. They're maybe, they sort of ignore reality, but it's actually more risky behavior. That's sort of number one. Number two,
we're trying to get to an end game. We see there's risk, we steer around it, or we get through it because we're really driven to complete that innovation. So maybe we avoid the risk because it's just going to get in our way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole like lean stuff is about eliminating the risk that's in front of us rather than patching it or working around it or just or sort of avoiding it. I think that the other part is that you know, there's a difference between people who found companies, so entrepreneurs that start a company, and the first dozen employees. The first dozen employees are not a heck of a lot different than anybody that joins a big corporation. That's my experience, you know, over the last 25 years. So I actually don't think, I think that the struggles that I have in managing my entrepreneurial team and my startups are not that different than what people face inside the corporations. I think it's what you measure. And so I think that we, as human beings, we optimize what we measure. And if the only thing that you measure inside of a large corporation is tasks over time, which is a very project management type of philosophy, then that's what you get. You get tasks over time. But if you actually measure people based upon impact, about actually moving closer to what your desired goal is, then you're going to see people that are able to change their behavior in order to achieve what you're measuring. So I actually think it's a measurement problem, not a
mindset.
Yeah, I mean, and so, you know, when we do accelerator programs for very large organizations, we do it for 90 days. And at the beginning, all of the employees are scared and they don't believe us. And they're looking at their leadership just going like, I don't trust you. And after we're done, 90 days, you've got 90%, 95% of the people that are saying, I never want to go back to the way I was working before. And the reason is because you've put them on teams. There's a social structure there that enforces things like behavior and accountability and culture and ethics even. But you're giving smart people the space and the room to exercise their intelligence and their creativity. If you give smart people the authority and empower them to solve problems, I think that they solve problems. And I think that's true inside of a large corporation. And I think that's true inside of a startup. And so I actually don't think there's this big, I think that the biggest problem is that leaders don't know how to do that. I think that's the biggest problem. And I think that they hire very large consulting companies to help them do that. And I think that those very large consulting companies are experiencing the exact same problems as the big corporations are, so that they don't help very much. And I also think, John, you brought up middle management at the beginning. I think middle management is so completely ignored inside these businesses. So there's a lot of these, you know, very executive leaders, and they're going to Brene Brown workshops, and they're learning all of these new skills around empathy and vulnerability and empowering. And then you down on the sort of the grassroots level, you've got people that are already practicing human-centered design thinking. They're running experiments, you know, they're working in agile fashion. And then there's this massive middle, which has a bunch of employees that are starting to behave differently, yet they've got leaders that are telling them, you know, oh, go do this change, but they're not teaching those middle managers how to do things differently. They're not changing the incentive structures to get those middle managers to behave differently. So I think it's just we're ignoring them rather than giving them the new skills that they need. And I've actually even sort of picked up on a trend where people are starting to talk about it. People are starting to talk about the up-leveling the skills of the middle management. It's very difficult for them to delegate decision-making and delegating authority. But if we can get them to the point that they are able to do that, what they'll find is suddenly they get to become more strategic. They get to be proactive. They're not just fighting fires, and you can start a virtuous cycle that goes, you know, in the right way that you want it to go. And I think you would find that change happening. So yeah.
My experience in the corporate world was that there were a bunch of middle managers that had ownership of budget, and they were never happy with their budget, and they were always playing these little side games which they didn't tell you about, but which then undercut various things, so that when they got to budget time, they could take a bunch of budget, right? And so I think that they have specific incentives that are in place to cause them to optimize their resources. And that process is what leads to that body behavior, right? It's how do I get more budget in my control? And so there's a skill and attitude question. I want to sort of shift the conversation a little bit. You mentioned that HR won, and in the process, there's a bunch of people who talk about culture. I think Tim talks about culture, where the operating so that I do the culture thing without managing the impact makes a difference. You can have a bunch of people that are all busy doing a bunch of crap, not doing the other thing that they used to do, but who are still entirely ineffective or even more ineffective. So there has been a sort of a set of complaints on social media about Revolut, which is a management group that is particularly focused on rewarding outcomes, not rewarding being busy, not rewarding effort, but rewarding outcomes. And there's a bunch of people who are working there who are pissed off, who are leaving because they worked so hard and they missed by so much the target and they didn't get rewarded, right? So go into that a little bit. If I manage to outcomes instead of managing to effort, I end up with a toxic social environment.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, again, I think that how one does it depends upon the culture that's already there and what your business is. And you know, I think that if you're getting, so to me, that only makes sense is that if before you're getting rewarded by just doing a bunch of stuff and not driving impact, and now you're actually not getting rewarded because you're doing a bunch of stuff and not driving impact. I mean, I think that it's hard for me to respond to that, to be honest. There's something sounds funny about all of that. I think that most organizations that I've tried to work with respect to this, they manage outcomes in the same way they've always measured outcomes. It's like, it's money, right? So if you're, you know, you can incentivize salespeople to be rewarded based upon money. And, you know, that's sort of been true for as long as there's been salespeople. So to me, the fact that you can't get something similar to work for other people means that you're probably using the wrong metrics. And so, and there's also a structural element to it. I mean, to me, there's when I think about creating teams that are assigned missions, the idea is that if you aggregate all of the missions, then that division is accomplishing what their goal is. If all of the teams accomplish their mission and you roll that up, then the organization itself is achieving its mission. There's all sorts of external factors, of course, that can you know, hurt that effort. But the key is using what I call progress impact metrics. And John, in the startup world, and those of you involved in the startup world, you kind of understand what those progress impact metrics are, because they're, you know, if you're a startup investor, you don't get to just measure outcomes. You don't get to just sit there and go, well, where's the money? Because you know that it takes time for these efforts to get done. And so the key for using this hierarchical team structure is, do I have my missions defined right? And then do I have those teams resourced properly so that they are given the best chance to accomplish their mission? And so I think that doing it on an individual basis is very difficult. Like if you're trying to measure each individual, whether they are accomplishing, you know, their metric, because their dependencies, they're dependent on other people. And so then you're going to very quickly get sort of this waterfall effect where, well, everybody's protecting their own little part, and I don't care if anybody else achieves their metric as long as I get mine. And it's sort of creating the wrong incentive. Whereas if you have a team structure, and the missions are defined and the metrics are defined correctly, you're trying to get everybody to row in the same direction towards that larger objective. And so that is where your middle management is suddenly incentivized to be more strategic and proactive by assembling those resources in a way that they're most able to accomplish their objective. If you're just measuring the outcome, you tell everybody to execute harder. That's why nobody wants to do any of the exploration side. They don't even want to hear about it. They don't even want to. I was hired by this startup once they were a consulting firm, a consulting startup, and they wanted to create a product group. And I knew this was a mistake from the get-go because their business, the way you run a consulting business is so different than a product. You invest in products, in services, it's all about time and materials.
Oh,
And so, yeah. And so I just I really thought I had done my due diligence that no, they were going to invest in the product. And 6 months in, my boss was all like, well, you didn't hit any of your sales numbers. And I go, yeah, that's not investing. You're treating me just like another consultant. What we did do is launch this product, pivoted, and found a customer. And actually we got this great contract that sort of shows what direction we should be going in. And I said, what I feel like is you're telling me that I failed to execute, when what I did is I built a product. And so, yeah, no, I left the company. If we don't get the incentives right and we don't get the team structure correctly, then we're not, people are not going to hit their numbers, and it's going to create a toxic environment.
Right. And so the advantage of startups is that we're never resourced properly. And so the only thing we can do is to be clever and do it, in a quick and fast way with very, very scrappy sort of way, right? So we have to do the 80-20 rule and spend the 20% of the effort to get us 80% of the data, and then just leap into the void that's there, which bigger companies not really willing to do that, right? They want the 90% data, and they're willing to spend the 95% of the budget to get to the 90% data.
Right. So, I mean, there's the case studies in the book from the corporate perspective are examples of, well, so maybe it's unfair, but Intuit has sort of always built their companies around these philosophies. And they've never said, here's the innovation silo. It's everybody has to do their version of customer development, including the executives. They have these things called follow me homes, where they actually have to go and watch their customers interact with their product. This is core business, execution side of the business. Other big companies that are in the book, 3M and Cargill, launched these company-wide initiatives bringing new products to market. And so they are touching all of the core businesses plus R&D, and they bring in this centralized team. And it's a cross-functional, interdisciplinary team that is now launching something new. And so the core business has a stake in it because they're essentially investing into the development of this new product. And it's not kicked out and spun out. It's leveraging the existing distribution. It's leveraging all of the assets that they already have. And matter of fact, it was interesting, Cargill in particular, they wanted to enter the alternative protein market. And so they didn't feel like they had to go invent that. They actually sat back and watched and to see what was going on and where they could actually help the most. And where they figured out was, their distribution was going to be able to launch these products, and they launched products as experiments, and it was really extraordinary. And so 3M did something similar, and ING has restructured their business based upon visiting companies like Zappos and Spotify and Amazon, and tried to get, how do you get these team structures to work differently instead of the silos of product and marketing and sales? How do you actually assemble teams to accomplish what your goals are? I mean, we're so stuck in, this really has nothing to do with entrepreneurial spirit or innovator's dilemma or anything. We're just stuck in this structure that says that we have to have groups of people organized based on function. Whereas if we just sat there and thought, how am I going to organize my teams based upon what we're trying to accomplish, based upon missions, we could structure the company differently, and you would have a different dynamic from the get-go.
I want to say something about that specifically, John, if I might. And as you were talking about the middle management component and some of the dilemmas there, it reminded me of my time in the military, and that I could be in a unit, I could be in a squad, and we have the medic, we have the gunners, we have the, like, each piece that we need as a unit to survive a situation, right? Even though we have branches and divisions and the tankers and the air defenders and all that, within each discrete unit, you have what you need to meet your goal. And so I appreciate, Brent, that you went on and gave some examples of that, because I was like, I need some examples of that.
Well, so General McChrystal's Team of Teams is a great book. Highly recommended.
Cool.
And so I think that to me, this is, I leverage his book in my book, because it's really not surprising that the military would be the first to encounter sort of the new world. And it happened within a couple of years in Iraq. And so according to McChrystal, you know, we go into Iraq, and when we run up against the traditional military, we, you know, it's over in weeks, right? But then we run into what represents the new world, this ad hoc, networked, informal, popping up everywhere. We actually had a lot of problems until McChrystal reorganized the special task force to take on Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that special task force is like Agile. It's the team's approach, and decentralized decision making, so that units, when they go around a corner and suddenly they encounter something, they actually have the operational ability, not just the empowerment, but the ability to respond to the situation that's in front of them, as opposed to phoning it in and waiting for orders. And so then even the support part of the equation is, you know, sort of readily available based upon circumstances that can arise at any moment. And so I appreciate that analogy a lot. And a matter of fact, I use special forces as an analogy too, because there again, you've got a very specific mission, and you resource that team that's required for the mission. And beyond that, it doesn't matter what the rank is of the individual members. Individual members are in charge of a particular component of the mission based upon their expertise. And so in the most, arguably one of the most hierarchical institutions in the world, you actually have situations where the hierarchy doesn't run the show. It's the expertise needed in order to accomplish a mission. And of course, McChrystal's book is Team of Teams. And so that's where you introduce this layered concept, so that the missions on the ground, aggregated, accomplish the missions at the higher level. So if you look at that structure, I actually don't think McChrystal figured this out for corporates. It's not a surprise, but I think that the idea of how he took on this new networked, you know, interconnected world is spot on. And it's because that world is identified by complexity and uncertainty. And so you have to operate differently in the face of that uncertainty. And if you look at some of the tech companies, Spotify has a different organizational structure. You know, I kind of thought, I was one of those people that thought Zappos holacracy was just, you know, sort of hippie capitalism. But when I talk to them and you break it down, it's actually just a different flavor of Agile. And they actually have developed an internal economy in order to get people to go where they want to go, but also drive the impact, or it doesn't fly, right? If you actually don't drive impact, it doesn't fly. And so it's built upon, from the very get-go, sort of the trust that people are going to figure it out. And if they don't figure it out, they have to move somewhere else. It's a way to self-organize, which again is self-organize is a key word in the Agile Manifesto. And a lot of times, John, you're similar to the metrics and the toxicity that you were talking about before. A lot of that large Agile implementations have driven the same sort of toxicity because people are focusing on the structure rather than of Agile, rather than what the principles of Agile are. And so, yeah, it's a tall order, I think, to get the companies to do this, but I think they have to. I don't think it's a choice. And at some point,
it's always a choice. Adapt or die, right?
Well, okay, so that, yeah, right. But I think that there's a lot of these things that are going on inside these organizations. They're just in pockets now, and I think it's the key is that it has to be behavior based. It's not just sort of this top down. One of the companies that I worked with was Roche Diagnostics, or this one was Roche Diabetes. And the leader was really literally saying, why can't I just say, go be agile, and these companies will be more agile? And it's because you have to actually get the root behavior change. And it's the first step of even building trust, is that the leaders can say, wait a second, these people can do this. And it does work. It does drive impact. And so we're never going to get anywhere if we aren't able to demonstrate that.
So Tim posted in the chat that he wanted to understand more about your 90-day sprints and what they actually learn, a little bit more concreteness to what they actually do and learn, and otherwise how you change that group's behavior.
Yeah, so what we do is the typical pattern is that we'll have a number of different teams, anywhere from 5 to 10 teams of 5 to 10 people. Some of these companies will just continue to stack people on side these teams. So we no longer are a Jeff Bezos 2 pizza team. We're more like a 3 pizza team. But basically what we're teaching them is our sort of flavor of a combination of design thinking, lean startup, and agile. And so the agile component is things like stand-ups, where we're all talking about what what our role is. These teams are, again, they're in an agile fashion, they're self-organized and autonomous. So the group themselves, the team themselves, gets to decide what work they're doing and how they're doing the work and how they're organized in order to achieve the mission. And so with leadership, we're defining the missions. And then we teach the teams, all of the members of the teams learn how to basically do customer development, develop empathy for stakeholders. And I say stakeholders because oftentimes, especially in a healthcare field, customers or patients aren't the only stakeholders. You have healthcare providers, you have internal stakeholders, government regulators. And so we teach them actually how to go learn from their stakeholders, their customers, and we teach them how to run experiments. So using a disciplined method, it's the scientific method. I kind of put that in scare quotes because it isn't pure science, but it's hypothesis driven, running experiments, measuring people's behavior to indicate whether we're on the right path or not. So we're trying to test out our assumptions about a particular way of resolving a particular issue. So the empathy is the design thinking part, and the experiments is sort of the lean startup part. And then we're operating in a agile fashion. So we're doing retrospectives and we're doing share outs. And so during the share outs, what happens is these teams share with leadership what they've been working on. So we teach them how to tell a story of presenting evidence. So this isn't a pitch competition. I hate pitch competitions. Ideas are just a dime a dozen, a dime or 2 dozen because of deflation or inflation. And so what we wanted them to do is tell a story of here's what we assumed, but when we learned from our customers, we moved this way, and here's the response to that movement. And so that we teach the leadership inside these meetings, sort of like board meetings, we teach them new skills. What are the right metrics that they should be looking at? What are the, what sort of questions do they ask? How do they remove barriers? Because we're dealing with uncertainty here, it can't just be work harder or what's the outcome. It's really, again, more like a startup board where it's mentoring, advising, holding accountable to metrics. And so that's what the 30 days looks like. Usually the sprints are 30 days, and then we do 3 of those. And what we hope to do is at the end of 90 days, get to a budget decision. And the budget decision is not, okay, now you're a functional department and you'll get an annual budget. It's here, you get another tranche of money in order to prove your next milestones. So that's what our sprints look like.
So I've been trying for over a decade to get startups to do experiments. And I would have to say that the data that I have is that I fail miserably. I don't fail a little bit, I fail miserably. I've been part of Adam Burke and his $1 million valuation challenge, where we tried to get over 3,500 people to actually do one build, measure, learn loop. I've stood in front of 3 startup weekends where there were 100 people in the room, where we will pay you money if you just document learning. And 0 of the people in the startup weekends, and only 7 people out of 3,500 have been paid. And so I want to talk about that experimentation process, right? People don't really want to do that experimentation. How is it that you get it to stick? And have you ever gone back to the teams like 6 months, a year later to see if they actually are still doing experiments in a reasonable, rational way?
Yeah, so a couple of ideas on there. One of the advantages of corporates is that if they're told to run experiments, they actually have to run experiments, and so they do run experiments. So there is a little bit of a difference between that and sort of the startup team. I also think that, you know, I love Eric Ries, but build, measure, learn is the least intuitive way of thinking about an experiment as there is out there. If you actually tell those same teams that if you're doing split testing in your engineering, they're going to say like, oh no, we're doing that all of the time. So the thing is that you actually want to leverage how it is that they're already doing it, and then showing them how they can apply the same philosophy to other parts of the business. And of course, you mentioned Trevor Owens. Back in the day when he was doing the lean startup machine, all of those quote unquote startup weekend people were doing experiments the whole time. And so it's certainly possible to do it. Getting them to do it on their own is difficult. And I don't know, that bigger question is maybe the more scary question is, a year later, are they still doing it? In some of the corporations that we've worked with, it has become entrenched. In a vast majority of them, it has not.
So can you name any of the ones where it has become entrenched? Are there some examples that we can talk about?
Yeah, I mean, ING is it's sort of built into their company. They have a program called Pace Every Day. So they developed their internal program, lean innovation program, was called Pace, but they have both Pace Every Day, and then they have Pace for, H2s, and then the Horizon 2, the 2 or 3 years, and then they have Pace for the longer term innovation. And so in particular banking units, depending on the leadership, that is just standard operating processes to think of things in terms of experiments. Now, it doesn't mean that they're documenting it on like the moves the needle experiment loop anymore. And I don't think anybody is ever going to put that stuff inside of Steve Blank's, Launchpad software. Nobody's going to document that sort of stuff. But I think that even the way I tend to run my own experiments, once you kind of grok it and it becomes part of you, I think that sort of being a little bit more informal about it is okay. We're running experiments literally all of the time. The other company that does it all the time is Intuit. It's just built into their processes. Theirs is way more rigorous. They'll do, pop-ups. They'll actually present people CDs and say, hey, this has got your data on it. You know, do you want to pay for it? And people will pull out money to pay for it. And they'll go, oh, I brought the wrong CD. And then they'll go back and they'll make it right with that customer, but they're actually running real experiments. So those are two that come to mind. It's not like they email me when they continue to run experiments, but
right. It would be really useful in the broader context of the ecosystem development if you went back and measured whether or not anything stuck, because my experience with all of my efforts is that for the most part it doesn't stick.
Well, and of course I don't work with startups.
No, I understand, but at the place that I've been pushing, when I go tell people to do customer discovery, they lean on their intuition way more than they can afford to, right?
Well, I agree with that. I totally agree.
I want to press on another issue a little bit.
Okay.
You talk about stakeholders, and I struggle with that a little bit, because what I want is for people to understand who actually will pay them. And so I want them to qualify who's actually a customer before they do customer discovery. And so I want them to run some kind of filter that will tell me this person is an early adopter customer. And I can't do that if I do the blah, 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 are you a user? And I can't talk to thousands of people that are stakeholders, because I won't actually narrow it down to who's actually customer. And customers are people that pay you. So you need to find willingness to pay to solve the problem in your customer discovery. Pre-product, pre-solution, just, are you willing to spend money to scratch the itch with me? And if you are not willing to do that, then I don't want to talk to you. I want to find the early adopters who are willing to move today so that I can do something today. Because my number one risk as a startup is starving to that.
Well, so the last sentence is actually the key to that. So so I purposely use the word stakeholders when I'm talking to enterprises, because their riskiest assumption might not be the customer. The riskiest assumption might be something else. It could be their compliance team. So, I mean, so I think that I don't disagree with anything that you said. I think the key, though, is what is the riskiest part of whatever it is that you're trying to, whatever it is you're trying to solve. And so I use stakeholder because we've worked with unions and they don't have customers. And we've worked with one of the companies that actually did spin out a startup that I mentioned earlier, actually had to go to an insurance regulator and get permission to be able to go and do something. And so to me, if they were mapping that out on a whiteboard to begin with, the fact that you actually would put all your stakeholders on that whiteboard inside of the ecosystem that you imagine, to me, that makes sense. And it might be, let's start with this stakeholder, because if the insurance regulator doesn't allow us to do it, it doesn't really even matter if the customer wants it or not. Now, of course, you could do it reverse. You could actually go and talk to the customers first and have some evidence that you're bringing to the insurance. But the nature of the conversation is such that, starting one with the other, it kind of doesn't matter. So that's the only reason why I use the word stakeholder. I think for startups in general, you're exactly right. I mean, I don't care about the distinguish between user and customer. Who's going to pay me? I totally agree with that. I think in the corporates, it becomes more complex. And I think healthcare also becomes, more complex, because there are so many different players in there. If you go and talk to a customer, do they want to avoid getting diabetes because they're at high risk diabetes? You could actually be pretty assured that they actually want to, whether you can get a medical device approved or something, just again that, or you can get reimbursed, by one of the payers in the ecosystem. Those things also matter quite a bit. And so again, it kind of depends upon the ecosystem that you're playing in.
So do you use any of the Simon Wardley maps to map out the structure of any of that?
No, I don't. in good Silicon Valley fashion, I tend to invent everything myself. I think it's just what allows me to help think through this stuff. And so I sort of have my own version of like an ecosystem map that I created. As a matter of fact, the Entrepreneur's Guide to Customer Development had that, and Steve Blank absolutely hated it.
Well, we both can agree that Steve Blank is opinionated, so we can go from there. So,
well, if he had loved it, he would have chosen my book instead of Alex Osterwalder's, maybe. But anyway, that's a different story. I'm joking.
Right. Yeah. So I end up using Ashmoria's Lean Canvas because it's a lot more tactical and able to, focus down on the what I have to do now conversation rather than the abstracty mushy part of the.
Well, it's actually built for tech startups. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that process of, doing a startup, the classic answer is that we get acquired. And in health tech, we get acquired relatively early compared to tech startups. And so our journeys might be a little bit shorter in a sense, right? So we see these healthcare companies which have like essentially no innovation in them, except that they have an acquisition arm that goes and acquires their innovation in the system, right? How do you process the I will do innovation by acquisition as compared to I will do innovation in a distributed way?
Yeah, I mean, again, it just kind of depends on what one means by innovation. I mean, the reason why a startup ecosystem works is because you have 1,000 startups trying, that figure out one solution that'll work at scale. And it could be that there's another dozen or even 24 that continue to work, just not at the same scale. And maybe they're serving different market segments. And so I think that again, to me, the premise that a large company can do that just doesn't make any sense, because why would they be any better than a whole ecosystem of 1,000 startups? And so I think that, listen, I have very strong beliefs that we have gone completely off the rails in terms of antitrust. We're not enforcing any of the rules of capitalism right now, and it's absurd. And we're finally seeing, hopefully, a change, but it's really extraordinary how really kind of across the political spectrum, we believe this myth that bigger is better. And it's absurd, and it's really hurting the economy right now because that's what's causing the supply chain issues. And a matter of fact, there's just a great Substack newsletter that I highly recommend. Matt Stoller, he wrote the book last year or a couple of years ago called Goliath, and he's very active on Twitter. And his newsletter is just eye-opening, just amazing. And of course, who it hurts the most, to be honest, are other businesses. It's the small and medium-sized businesses that actually get adversely affected by this complete ignoring of antitrust regulations. They end up controlling the distribution channels that all small businesses have to use. And then if those distribution channels have a single source of failure, then suddenly you have the supply chain issues that we have. And you have ridiculously high rents that are charged. And, Amazon is, to be honest, is one of the worst. And so I really think that, the job of the government, in my view, is to create competition. Competition actually solves most of the problems that we're facing in society right now, to be honest. Wages, the disparity in incomes, the struggle of small business and entrepreneurs, a lot of that stuff is really solved by a government that's committed to creating competitive markets. Now I went on a mini rant here. What's that?
At the opposite of scale, down several levels.
Levels. I mean, if it ends up shaking out that you get to certain industries that are better served by oligopolies, that's fine. But you probably don't need 1,000 different cell phone companies. But, just in the last 10 years, we've gone from 5 or 6 down to, 3 or something. So we will see inefficiencies out of that eventually, I think. I also think that there are certain industries that you can look at that say, yes, that industry will benefit from economies of scale. But economies of scale, again, is sort of an industrial age metric, right? If you're manufacturing, then you do get economies of scale in terms of the cost of producing output. But if you're actually writing code, there's not a lot of economies of scale when it comes to software that's distributed over the internet. And so there's, if you look at the amount of competition that's actually in streaming right now, that actually is an indication of what economies of scale in the digital world looks like. And so it's really kind of interesting. But here I've just gone on a antitrust rant, John, and I've forgotten what your original question is.
Yeah, so I was, I've been so interested in it that I haven't been tracking either. The Wordly maps end up being a useful tool, I think, to understanding the broader context. I think that our startup scene has been able to generate a bunch of stuff, and through that we get this innovation through acquisition.
Oh,
and we're trying to get you to compare and contrast this innovation by acquisition versus innovation by distributed innovation as a corporate habit. Right.
So okay. Yeah. Thank you for bringing me back to that. So I think it depends on what you mean by innovation. And so I think that the big life-changing, world-changing, company-changing innovation is going to happen through acquisition, or it could happen through venture capital, right? Venture capitaling, like companies running their own venture. Those are, again, a company is not going to discover a new unicorn. Very likely. It's very hard to imagine. A lot of the other innovations that happen that are more micro, I actually don't mind acquisition there either, but I do think that the companies have the ability to do it internally. And if they're focused on what their specialization is, they can bring a lot to the table. So one of the examples of, like in my book, 3M, is that they actually teamed with a startup plus a grant from the Department of Energy, which is super interesting. Right. The amount of federal money is extraordinary. It ends up going to mostly big companies, not small companies. And so the Department of Energy, because they helped fund 3M's partner with a startup in order to bring a new idea to market, but leveraging 3M technology. So there's a great example of open innovation. Whether 3M ends up acquiring that startup or not, I kind of don't care. In the retail space, there's all sorts of examples of very large international conglomerates buying very successful smaller businesses and giving them a distribution at scale that the little company may never have gotten. And those big companies actually allow the littler company to continue to operate independently. Tom's of Maine is an example of that. And I think Trader Joe's is actually an example of that. They've maintained their culture. They've maintained their own special way of doing things, but they get a scale that's just sort of the larger businesses. So, I don't know. I'm kind of an antitrust guy, but some of those things maybe are okay. I think a lot of the acquisitions are technology or innovation destroying, and that's technically illegal, and yet we allow that to happen all the time. In other words, you acquire a company just to not make that product available. So yeah. I think that should be illegal. I think that there's other times where you're just trying to hire. So that one's not. That doesn't bother me either, though I don't know that they work that well. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's an interesting question, and I don't think that there's one size fits all. I mean, I think that we focus too much on unicorns and not establishing a system where businesses that are inevitably small or medium sized, that should be deemed a huge success. And we should have financing mechanisms that make those people successful. And so, you know, in all of these different communities outside of Silicon Valley, a lot of these communities have a lot of people that are playing startup, and they go in and get equity investments when they have no business getting an equity investment. But part of the problem is that there's not a lot in between. We're starting to see that there are alternative investment vehicles out there, revenue-based investments, investments where businesses return dividends or even interest rather than it being based upon equity. And what's interesting to me about that is that it also fills this like huge void in the middle where as an investor, it's very difficult to get something in between, right? It's like an equity play where it's the risk of the stock market dominated by day traders, or it's, you know, less than 1% on a savings account. And so having interest-based or dividend-based returns for investors, I think would be a win on both sides of the equation. And we're starting to see a pickup of those type of investments. And I think that if we can then attach that to our startup ecosystems and say, listen, if what you're doing is a lifestyle business, congratulations, that's really hard. And you should be proud of what you've accomplished. And really, in a lot of ways, the backbone of the economy. So I think that there's a little mindset change that the ecosystems can help with.
So we have hold on a second. We have the Zebra Unites group that is basically counter-positioning themselves as anti-unicorns, which are straight in the middle of what you just talked about in Portland. We have the revenue-based financing book by Looney Libs, who's doing essentially equity-based revenue redemption, as well as revenue debt, right? We have a revenue redemption clause in the Seattle Angel Conference term sheet. So there's a bunch of people that are doing that work, and it really spreads the opportunity out. But the fundamental problem is that the laws are set to make it expensive for us to do that.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to write group checks of 50,000. The costs are too high, right? I cannot afford to do it because of SEC limitations about how I can do it, right? And so we have structures in place that are designed to create economies of scale in moving money, which make it difficult to fund these businesses.
Yeah, well, I mean, so those are the things that are relatively easy to change if we actually had the will to do it, right? You know, I mean, I know you have the will, but I mean, in terms of the political will, because it's just a law. I don't know if you're.
It's an SEC regulation, actually, right? So it's something that requires the SEC to pay enough attention to change their mind, which they are not really that worried about, and so it's very difficult. I want to make sure Alicia has an opportunity to get her thought in.
Well, thank you. We've moved on a little bit, but I wanted to just say, I used to be part of an organization called Open Health Tools, and my job was to help bring together the world's largest consumers of healthcare IT and the world's largest producers of healthcare IT. So, you know, the NHS, the VA, along with IBM and Hewlett Packard. But our vision and our mission was about, you know, coordinating with the small and medium-sized open source healthcare businesses. And one of the ways that we talked about this is being stewards of our ecosystem, right? And I will continue to hope that that conversation is still happening in places like HP and IBM, but also, you know, where do we have opportunities to just keep saying that and reminding these big, what I don't want to call them our big brothers because that's a little weird, but, you know, how do we encourage them to be good stewards of the ecosystem that we startup founders, we small businesses, we are essential to growth and for all of us to meet our vision and mission. So
I actually don't have clarity on how to get people who are worried about their short-term metrics to think about the cultivating of the forest of tomorrow, right?
But you know, inside those big corporations, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people that actually do think about it, and so it's actually empowering those people inside the organization to be able to go and do it. I think that and a matter of fact, when you get down one level from the sort of the companies that tend to dominate the news, you actually have these very large companies that do pay attention to that stuff. They just don't generate the political or media mindshare. And internationally, of course, that's even more true than in the US. And there are things that we could do. Again, it's just whether organizations like the SEC will pay attention. So for example, NASDAQ goes to the SEC and says, we want all companies that are listed to report on their diversity metrics, right? And so that's like, those type of changes can happen very quickly where there's the will. And there's absolutely no reason that we don't include sustainability metrics or other metrics in reporting on a quarterly basis, just along with the financial metrics. That's a market-based solution that will drive change. And it's like trivial to do compared to, we like to tinker with stuff on the edge, like the outcomes. We want to try to, like, we're managing to the outcomes. And the problem is those are the most politically charged part of the equation. And it's where everybody feels like it's a zero-sum game and we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. You know, how many, can I get any companies to move their headquarters from Seattle to San Diego, as if that's like some sort of big win. And so we tinker on the edge, whereas like the law that you're talking about, or the law that I'm saying, like, just listen, these companies, if they want to be public, they have to publish not only their financial metrics, but diversity metrics, sustainability metrics, whatever other metrics we want. They have to use this, these assessments already exist. Nonprofits produce these. B Corp, the nonprofit that does benefit corps and B Corps, already has these assessments. They can be.
So I put into the chat the Sustainable Accounting Board is one of the standards that accountants can figure out how to do. And I put up, we picked our finalists for Seattle Angel Conference 20 this week. And one of the finalists is Earth Up, which is providing a SaaS platform to do what you just said. And so that particular rant needs to be updated so that
and I was just at SaaStr, and I was really surprised at how many companies are directly in that space, how to help marry big corp to the folks that improve their.
Yeah, my point is that it needs to be made a law that they have to report those on a quarterly basis. And so that's actually what drives the change. I'm glad there's all these organizations that are working on the assessments, but I mean, the key is that shareholders and consumers and everybody else gets to see that, gets to the transparency is what drives the change.
I believe that those motions are already underway. And so you'll see something in the next year or so, I think, in that process.
Yeah, I hope so.
So, do you know about Calm Fund, Tyler Tringus?
No.
Tyler Tringus has produced a thing that used to be called Earnest Capital that's now called Calm Fund, that's doing a revenue-based investment in startups that are not the unicorn hunters, but good business hunters. And so it's an example, I think, of what you're looking for.
Yeah, there's one down here in San Diego that Kim Folsom runs, First Capital, and she'll be talking at my conference here in November 7th. There's a woman that was a Techstars graduate who's in Atlanta, I believe, runs Enrich Her. So it's definitely one of those things that's cropping up everywhere and ecosystems everywhere. But I think it's another thing that, we just need to shine a light on it, because I mean, I'm talking to startup entrepreneurs in San Diego all the time, and they don't realize that there's these other. And of course, where people go are law firms to get recommendations for those type of things. And the law firms don't know about these things. So it's really just on us to shine a light on all of these different organizations.
Right. The law firms are back a century in terms of their advice to people. So it's really difficult to lead with lawyers telling you about innovations. It's really troublesome. But we do run workshops on the pathways to funding, and we do talk about how to fund the 50% of companies rather than the 0.1% of companies. And so
Yeah.
there's a lot that we can do there, especially around things like CDFIs and other mechanisms that are available to people that have their business basics in place. And that's the place where I think there's a great shortage, is in this notion of getting your business basics down so that you will become fundable, right? And so we have a lot of work to do there. I want to make sure that folks have a chance to ask questions. So, Michael got a question.
Shaiwal had a question in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see that. What was Shaiwal's question? How do you think the ideal mix between empowered team and coordinated missions? Also, how do you think about the mix between employees that prefer structure and the others that prefer self-determination?
Yeah, I think that my idea is that everybody is put on a team, and some teams are going to face less uncertainty and so are going to feel very structured because the work is known that needs to be done. If you're building a software product, it's quite possible that you just have all engineering people on a particular team. So it's, the inside of a team, you're going to have people that if they just kind of want to go along, they're allowed to go along. I actually think COVID sort of brought this home too. In my view, it's way better to have a social structure that holds other team members accountable than trying to get managers to hold all of their individual people accountable via Zoom. This is why middle managers are pulling their hair out, because it's very difficult to do. And it's why they all say like, oh, I just want you to come back into the office. So somehow if I see your face in the office, in your cubicle, I'm happy. I'm satisfied that you're actually doing your job. And if you're at home, you might be walking your dog. Well, I want my employees to go walk their dog. I want them to get their job done. I don't care if they're walking their dog. So I think that people that want more structure are going to find as much structure as they want inside the team that they're on. And so I think that even if your jobs don't naturally fall into teams, you can still you build a team that has that social structure. So my company has always been distributed, and I'm very small now, but a couple of years ago, we were up to 17 or 18 people or so. And we used to have, video on Fridays. And so everybody that was working that day would work the whole day with their video on. And it was actually very amazing how close that was to being in the office. After a while, you're not conscious about it. It's not like you have to stare at the video. You're just doing your work. And if a question pops in your head, you ask somebody and you get an answer right there, as opposed to the 2 or 3 days it takes to get a email, or the several hours or a day it takes to get it from Slack. And people are joking and stuff like that. So it's very quickly you can actually create a very similar environment. And I think that there's all sorts of creative ways that people have come up to sort of maintain some sort of a social structure, even if doing the remote thing. We used to have what we called a jam budget. And a jam budget is that we would set aside money every month that people could actually go and use that money to travel to the same location if there was a specific project that they were working on where they felt like they would get more done if they were all in the same room. So they would all travel together and go to a co-working spot and jam on a particular problem. And so I think, again, that people find that sort of thing fun. And so I think people that are, believe it or not, I'm an introvert. And so I enjoy my time. I get re-energized by being by myself. The pandemic was a little bit extreme for even me in that regard. But, there are people that there's plenty of things to do where the structured people will get what they have to do. It's just, to me, it's better that they've got a team that perhaps can provide, ongoing mentoring and inspiration and the things that they need to work on, learning how to collaborate to accomplish goals, as opposed to just a manager giving them a to-do list.
Yeah, cool. Any other thoughts or questions?
Can you tell us about your conference? What's that about?
So, it's a lead up to the book. It's at endlessdisruption.com. And so the goal is to demonstrate that even though my book is really sort of more focused on corporates, the changes that are happening from the industrial age to the digital age are happening everywhere. And so I've got some interesting speakers from corporate innovation, startups, education, healthcare, government, that are applying sort of these things that are what I consider the entrepreneurial spirit, plus taking on, hopefully head on, topics like women in innovation and diversity, where, to me, it's part of the solution. And when you're dealing with complexity, the greater the diversity, the more likely you are to figure out the uncertainty that you're facing. That's the extraordinary thing. So ethics aside, I think that ethically we should be more diverse and empowering. But even if you wanted to look at it from a pure business point of view, if you're facing uncertainty or complexity, then a greater diversity of people, background, economic, education, all of these things mean that you're going to have more creativity in the solutions. You're going to appeal to a larger audience, so therefore a larger market. So it just makes business sense. And so we'll have some panels there that'll be tackling those. And I just have, I think, an extraordinary group of people, presenting for, I think we got, 6 hours of November 4th. So it'd be great for people to join, endlessdisruption.com. And you can get a free ticket, or you can buy a ticket and get a copy of the book.
There you go. Cool. Any other questions or thoughts? Shaiwal? He's off in the meeting already. No, there he is.
I'm good, thanks.
Right.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm good, thanks.
Tim, how about you? Have any questions? Cool. So there we go. You got to you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I'm mute. The only thought that came to mind about diversity is, my understanding is diversity is helpful, yes, for creative thinking, but there's a cost if speed is an essential aspect of your business. Because the more diverse the thinking, the longer it takes to make decisions. That comes out of research from a fellow at Stanford. I forget his name right now.
Yeah, I mean,
the construction of teams matters in terms of the mission that they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends on what your mission is, but also, you might be able to improve that just by the way you're running your meetings. So I bet you there was a variable there that researcher didn't take into consideration. It's kind of funny. It reminds me of the whole work versus at home versus in the office. And it's like almost impossible to think of people of gray areas in there. It's got to be like one way or the other. And like, oh, all the research shows this and all the research shows that. And, those type of things, I have a hard time with it because I think that there's no way for them to control for a lot of different variables.
Brent, in your research and writing the book, what was the most interesting thing that you learned?
Well, when I sort of changed where I was going with the book based upon actually what I sold to the publisher, which was really sort of like, hey, there's these 10 steps. And I think what was amazing to me was to find the companies that had been operating sort of in this lean innovation way for 5 or 6 years now, not only companies, this includes the city of government, their response to COVID was like absolutely extraordinary. Like I didn't even come up with this acronym of RAD, resilient, aware, and dynamic, until I saw what these companies had done within weeks of the pandemic, had fundamentally changed what they were doing in order to keep their core business going. And it was really because of the environment that they had created over the last several years of sort of practicing this behavior of developing empathy and running experiments and those type of things. And so it's very unusual for you to be able to, you know, predict something like, if people behave this way, this is the result that they're going to get. And then to actually see it come true, right? I mean, that is sort of the real scientific method, is when you actually get to see it put into place. And so the pandemic actually afforded me that, in the sense that 3 of the companies that I had worked with, not all of the companies in the book I worked with, but 3 of the companies that I did, all had what I thought were extraordinary responses to COVID because they had already implemented this thinking in their company. I think beyond that, there are mature, large organizations, and I'll throw 3M and Cargill in this bucket, where I was surprised how much cross-functional, interdisciplinary teams they had already going on inside their organization. And so I think that was maybe the surprise, because if you looked at their marketing stuff, you wouldn't necessarily see them any differently than any other big company that's got, you know, the innovation buzzword littered all over their website. But then to see it inside the company, and of course 3M, if you dig into their history at all, you can sort of see that they understand the difference between invention and figuring out how to bring invention to the market, which I think is a, you know, a difference that a lot of companies lose. And so I thought they still have a lot of kind of that middle management mindset that will put a brakes on a bunch of stuff, but they also had specific programs to overcome that, which I thought was super cool. And so I guess I would consider that the surprise.
Cool. So one of the things that I would like to ask for people to do is to say things about this workshop. If you learned anything, put it into your social media. And if you're not using social media, please do use social media, because it is a great way for you to do stuff. I know, Alicia, that there are hesitations in there. However, even for a non-participant in Twitter, Twitter can teach you a lot about raising money.
You know, I'm all over the Twitter.
I do know that. But the number of people that put their Twitter address into their LinkedIn is inordinately small. And the number of people that go to events of some kind and say something about that event is also inordinately small. So we just had 64 people go through the Angel Conference to get down. Yes, you too. Yes. And how many of the companies said anything on social media about their journey? 2. You are one of 2. Yes. Okay. So this process of, I have a tool, but I won't pick it up and use it, is inordinately common behavior. So if you were doing a business, you ought to be having a Twitter address, and that Twitter address should at least be connected to the people upstream that are likely to fund you, so that you can see when they belch about things, because they probably will tell you something about their belching.
John, that's so funny. That's like, it reminds me of like, I spoke at a Ericsson Innovation Conference, I don't know, like 8 or 9 years ago. And I followed a very famous CNN business anchor. He's very popular and British, I think, and very charming and gregarious. And he got up on stage and he told everybody to turn off their phones and get off of social media. And then he spent 10 minutes railing on the young generation and their social media and their phones and all this. And I followed him and I said, everybody get your phones back out, turn on, go on to social media, tweet my discussion. It's so funny.
Yeah. So specifically, I would like you to say something about the disruption conference on November 4th, so that Brent gets a little bit of play on that. I think it's important for people to understand this resiliency. We are in a time of uncertainty. We are in a time of great change. I mean, in the 1970s, we had a book called Future Shock, where life was going to be more complex and changes were going to be happening much, much more frequently, and we would have big disruptions. I would say we're here. And so we probably should adapt to that. And the thing that I think, the way I think about startups is about like bacteria, right? Bacteria are evolving all the time, and they go into all of these different corners, and some of the corners they get killed and some of the corners they don't get killed. And that's where our startups are driving our economy, right? Is that they rapidly learn about what's going on and adapt to what's going on. You cannot do that if you are one big thing going one direction. And so it's really important for us to adapt to this process and to communicate with other people about that process. So thank you for being here, Brett. I really enjoyed the conversation. I would love to engage with you more with our regular speaker series and try and help people get things going with this. We try to get 40 new investors every cycle. We now have the San Diego Angel Conference. So there's another clone of ours. We have one in Kelowna and in Alaska as well. So there's some other opportunities for you to go in and talk to people that are trying to think hard about how to grow and engage.
Yeah, we're working on Misty. We're working on her.
Yeah, good. So San Diego Angel Conference happened because of Misty, and because I used to work for her, and I said we got to do an Angel Conference, and we did one in Corvallis, and we trained her once about how to do that. So
yes, I helped her out down here get connected into the ecosystem.
Wonderful. And so if there's anything we can do, please let us know. And thank everyone else for coming. Our final Seattle Angel Conference is on the 17th of November. We have a workshop tonight on health company valuations, which is really about valuations. Almost nobody does their valuations right in the startup pre-seed phase. So it's going to be a good conversation. And next week, at this time slot, we have our journey of SAC 6 from seed to SPAC. And so on Monday, GWH went public. And now we have a Seattle Angel Conference company that's public, our first public company. And we'll talk about that journey with founders of the company. So,
well, thanks for having me, John, and happy to be engaged. You know, however you want, just reach out. I'll actually be up in Seattle Thanksgiving week. I don't know if you guys do anything in person, but
we haven't been yet, but I'd be glad to help connect. How early around Thanksgiving and how late are you going to be around?
I'll go home Saturday, and I'm trying to decide whether to come in Monday or Tuesday.
Well, I'm happy to help you connect with people. We just did a talk by Tristan Cromer, and in the process, we used some LinkedIn scraping to find a whole bunch of the corporate CIOs, the Chief Innovation Officers. So it would be possible to try and work through that group and see if there's anybody there that wants to chat.
Yeah, that would be fun. Ada's Books might want to host as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, glad to work on that process.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, and thanks for everybody else for hanging out for so long. It was fun discussion, and yeah, hope maybe I'll get to meet y'all.
Thank you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Brent. Appreciated it.
Thank you, Brad.
Thanks
Thank
much.
you, John. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.